Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming for tonight's event, Botanical Revolutions, a book talk with renowned artist and writer Giovanni Aloi. I'm Erin Searcy, Associate Vice President for Continuing Education. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, we have some technical announcements. Today's online lecture is closed captioned. You can access the captioning by clicking the live transcript captions button on your toolbar. We will turn to audience questions at the end of the talk. If time allows, please feel free to enter any questions you have by clicking the Q&A button on your toolbar at any point during the presentation. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. In addition to today's program, the New York Botanical Garden offers many classes, workshops, and public lectures in landscape design, horticulture, botanical art, gardening, and more. Our upcoming 27th Annual Landscape Design Portfolio Lecture Series welcomes 3 outstanding professionals. NYBG's very own Todd Forrest, award-winning landscape architects Walter Hood and Mi-Kyung Kim, to present innovative landscapes that enhance quality of life and satisfy our innate desires for nature and community. This evening, though, I am delighted to present Dr. Giovanni Aloi, who is dialing in from Illinois, where he teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He is an award-winning artist, author, educator, and curator, specializing in the representation of nature and the environment in art. Giovanni's approach embraces a holistic and global perspective, one that invites inquiry, fosters critical rethinking, and opens pathways for re-envisioning our relationship with the natural world. Tonight, Giovanni will discuss his book, Botanical Revolutions, a groundbreaking work that unearths the representation of plants and their vital impact on art, and advocates for the botanical world's legitimate place in art history. Please join me in welcoming Giovanni Aloi.
Thank you very much, Erin, for the introduction. Just a tiny clarification. Art historian, yes. Artist, not so much. I still consider myself mostly skilled at writing about, my professional dimension. But thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be able to present Botanical Revolutions here at the New York Botanic Garden. And I just want to give you pretty much an overview of what led to Botanical Revolutions, and also a chapter by chapter sort of overview of the content of the book, so you can get a sense of the journey that I have undertaken over the past few years. And it's a journey that you can also participate into as readers. So some of you might know my previous publications on the subject of plants in contemporary art already. This is not all of them, but certainly the ones that I have found more enjoyable and more sort of useful in terms of mapping new territory when it comes to the idea of what plants can do in contemporary art. Among the most recent is Lawn, that you see right here. This is a short book I'm particularly proud of because it's a more philosophical consideration and musings about the lawn and how it exists as a metaphor for our relationship with nature in our mind and how it impacts the environment, climate change, in so many intricate ways that oftentimes have a lot to do with much more than our yards. The lawn is like a kind of lens through which we end up understanding our place in the world. And this is a short book, about 30,000 words, that I've heard many people read in an afternoon, or like an evening and an afternoon, and enjoy very much because of its readability and sort of a range of suggestions on how we can detox from the lawn in our minds and in our yards. And of course, the Lucian Freud Herbarium that was published a few years ago now in at the end of 2019, and allowed me to really start to think about the many approaches that artists have dedicated to plants over time, how especially Lucian Freud was particularly unique when it came to treating his houseplants as individuals. And years and years of focusing on plants in art and questioning their presence, which has been largely overlooked by art historians over the past 200 years, has really led me to want to write what, in a sense, could be described as an alternative history of art, which is in Botanical Revolutions, How Plants Changed the Course of Art, which has recently been published by Getty. Now, Revolutions is a beautifully illustrated book. It's, in a way, following trajectories that some of you who are keen on art history might be familiar with. The structure of the book is somewhat chronological to try and outline a journey in time. Our engagement with plants has been particularly different at different times in the history of our global civilization. But at the same time, every chapter sort of has its own time frame and its own specific focus. So it's a pretty ambitious book in terms of what it does with its fragmented narrative. But one of the things that I think it does best is certainly to foreground plants and to bring into light moments in which plants have not only provided us with materials that are essential for the making of art, whether it be wood or canvases or pigments, as it is well known, but also moments in which plants have almost become collaborators with artists. And this is the challenge of the book, and a challenge that I want to explore with you as well tonight. Can we begin to think about plants as some kind of collaborator in the making of specific moments in art history? Can we think about art as unlocking the doors of perception as times, or inspiring new movements, or even pointing into directions of creativity that have become essential to the expressive potentials of artists throughout the last century and even moreover so today? I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea that plants have become particularly popular in contemporary art. For a few years now, it's hard not to visit a museum or a contemporary art gallery and not stumble in a potted plant or the topic of paintings and photographs being plants. Of course, there's so much involved here in climate change, so much involved in questions of sustainability, food, farming, but there's also more. The idea of plant intelligence, the idea that we have overlooked plants for so many centuries, relegated them to the background of art historical discourses, and also representationally really push them in the background of paintings in which we are always the subject, and that we've forgotten how wonderful they are all along. We have become plant blind, as it has been argued by botanists in the past, like Wandersee and Schlosser. So I wanted to take you through what Botanical Revolutions wants to accomplish, which is to make us see plants anew. And you can see through the table of contents that it is, as I mentioned earlier, organized through thematics that still do justice to a chronological order of some kind, but that also allow for important topics to surface. And in the introduction is where I laid the groundwork for a new understanding of plants in art, but also for a new understanding of plants in our lives. It is a task, right? It's complicated to do justice to such a broad context. But I like to begin from a place that I think it's particularly meaningful to where we stand today. There's a moment out of the many moments I could have picked in the history of this revolution that belongs to the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy. We're thinking about the Black Death, and we're thinking about 1346 and 1353. So this moment that changed the history of the world, where all of a sudden so many people perished. The economy of Europe was radically reshaped. Social classes shifted dramatically. And with all the upheaval and distraction that the Black Death brought to Europe, came a desire to philosophically reinstate the human at the center of it all. And this philosophical current was called humanism. It places the human at the center of the world by recovering classical texts that were written by Aristotle and Plato. And I've actually come to call this moment anthropocentric miseducation. Anthropocentric miseducation is this moment in which we decide that humans are the most important creature on this planet, and everything else is sidelined. Think about Aristotle's scala naturae, the hierarchy of beings, which of course places the human at the very top, mammals right below, and at the very bottom, plants, because they are incomplete animals in Aristotle's views. It is therefore not a surprise that when we explore beautiful works of art like Raphael's The School of Athens that you can see in the Vatican museums, Aristotle and Plato are positioned right at the center of this incredible scene filled with a multitude of men. There's only one woman in this fresco, and it's Hypatia of Alexandria, who was a mathematician. And everyone is white, of course. And as you can see here, there's not a single animal, there's not a single plant. Everything is about the genius of the human. And this specific proposition, this pushing nature out of the picture, continues throughout the centuries in Western art and culture until during the 19th century, it manifests itself through this desire to reconnect with nature. And we see it in the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, the Hudson River School. Yet again, it's always a human facing the enormity, the sublime, endless quality of nature that we cannot truly capture, that becomes sort of spiritual. These paintings, one of which you see here, capture the moment of alienation, the Industrial Revolution changing the lives of people so radically and so fast, so dramatically, and this desire to reconnect with nature at a point where perhaps it's too late to find our place in a way that can truly make a difference. So we're forever looking at nature from the outside in, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand it. And it's also at this moment that we find the consolidation of the artistic genius as this figure that during the Renaissance, of course, emerged in the guise of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and a solitary genius. The artist in the conception of Western art, starting from the Renaissance, remember, before the Renaissance, the artist worked in workshops as a collaboration process, and most often was either anonymous or not particularly well known. It's with the Renaissance that we have the big stars of the art world that we know today. And this idea, in a sense, is also key to the possibility of rethinking our relationship with plants. Can artists collaborate with plants in ways that may enable us to reconnect, that might enable us to find that connection point that is not so much just simply related to painting beautiful plants, but it's actually about coming to terms and negotiations with the vegetal world in very new and exciting ways. So I just wanted to start from the first chapter, which in a sense, it's somewhat ironic, at least because of the use of this beautiful image where you can see here Apollo and Hyacinth. Apollo is particularly distraught because Hyacinth died, and he brings Hyacinth back as a flower. So one of the important aspects of the conception of plants as inferior in the history of Western mythology, for instance, becomes particularly visible through some of the best known myths. So in this chapter, I contrast Western mythological and philosophical traditions, which often depict human to plant transformation as a form of degradation. And I look at other cultures and narratives in which metamorphosis actually signifies enrichment, kinship, and also mutual protection. And this is the beginning in this chapter of a call for reevaluation of plant representation in art, proposing that reconnecting with diverse cultural stories like indigenous stories, as well as older traditions of farming and agricultural practices, can enrich and point into new directions, restore reciprocal relationships with plants, and inspire more sustainable and equitable futures. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of Apollo and Daphne. In a sense, this is a story of violence. It's a story of a pursuit that turns into this moment, very dramatic moment, in which Daphne transforms herself into a laurel tree in order to escape the advances of Apollo. Of course, the sculpture is breathtaking in its detail, and you can clearly see in the upper part here how the accuracy, the attention to detail is outstanding in the way the laurel leaves extend from Daphne's hands. The bottom line of this transformation is wholly negative. Daphne wants to escape from Apollo, and by turning into a tree, she gives up all that is sensual, beautiful, and appealing about her. And Apollo, nonetheless, wants to own her in one way or another. So he turns her, the laurel tree at that point, into his emblem. It's a story of multiple forms of possession, very violent in itself, and one in which the plant has become first not desirable, and then only desirable once it becomes an emblem, a picture of itself, removed from its reality. So in this chapter I then explore the Aztec mythological figure of Mayahuel, who was a princess that, to escape, again, a relative, in this case, Tzitzimitzel, who wanted to destroy her, turns herself into an agave. And the agave plant is seen in Aztec culture as a generous, life-giving plant. Pulque, the drink that is extracted from the agave, has had for millennia important spiritual values. So you see how in other cultures, turning into a plant actually is a positive transformation. And from this specific moment, I also turn to Aboriginal art and how in Aboriginal art, the representation of plants is not so much grounded in traditional aesthetics as it is in the West, where it's the beauty of blooms and leaves that attracts the attention of the artist, but where plants appear as collaborators, as co-existent beings in a world where everything is equally important to everything else. So you can see how these different philosophies, these different approaches help us to recalibrate our relationship with plants. And it is from this standing point that the unraveling of different revolutions in the history of what we call civilization through art begin to emerge. One of the early questions that I posed myself as I started to write this book is how far deep can we go in really reconsidering our relationship with plants as more than an object-subject relations. And there are new philosophical currents that have now developed over the past 20 to 30 years. One of them is called new materialism, that invites artists to think about materials as active participants in the shaping of their work. This is again in stark opposition to Western philosophies of art, where the artist subjugated materials and imposed upon them their vision. And instead, what we find with new materialism through authors and thinkers like Karen Barad or Jane Bennett, that materials are always a starting point that comes to the table with specific qualities, specific manifestations of knowledge and histories that we have to fine-tune and listen to. We have to meet and negotiate. And that's exactly what's been happening throughout the history of art. It's just that the history of art has been written from the position of the artist genius who masters the world instead of discovering it, who imposes instead of listening. So I became fascinated with the history of traditional media, like papyrus, for instance. So you can argue that we turned papyrus into a substrate upon which we unleashed our knowledge and creativity. But what did the papyrus did to us is also interesting. For instance, Roman Senator Cassiodorus acknowledged that a faithful witness of all human actions, a sworn foe to oblivion, that is the papyrus. But papyrus enabled us to do so much more. It really extended our mind. It exploded its limits. Think about a reality in which we can now write down ideas in ways that can be recovered much more easily, expanded onto longer than ever rolls, much longer and much more spacious than clay cylinders as it was before, or tablets. And it's with this sedimentation of knowledge that can only happen because of the engagement with papyrus to create a substrate upon which we can draw and write, that plants allow us to expand our thinking. Plants allow us to expand our horizons. And of course, there are many more inventions, many of which you're familiar with, like the invention of paper in 105 current era, that changed even further our relationship with plants and with knowledge. So throughout the first chapter, I try to really think about this extending of the mind that would have never happened without the flexibility of plant matter. Books are not the same as tablets or cave paintings. Books are places in which we expand our horizons because of the materials that allow us to do so. And I became very fascinated with works such as these by Luo Ping, which is a beautiful example of a work of art in which plants are participating and collaborating with artists on different levels. Of course, there's the paper upon which the work is represented, but we also have a beautiful and delicate representation of an orchid. And the ink with which the orchid is painted is derived from burnt pines. And so you can see all this layer of vegetal essence coming into this beautiful representation and a poem that becomes part of the work of art. It is written with the same ink that drew the plant. And the poem gestures at what we can never access about plants when it comes to representations in art, which is their fragrance. So the poem claims that as we moved into the winter months and beyond, the foliage of orchids is not the most lush and beautiful, but in the memory resides their fragrance. In chapter 3, I explored these intricate collaboration between plants and the expansion of knowledge and art through books, more specifically. And I am particularly interested in this collaboration, this alliance between images and words, and the sort of underexplored chapter in the history of knowledge, where plants played an incredibly important role in fine-tuning our gaze and in our construction of the modern world. I'm sure you're all familiar with early herbals. Herbals are among some of the earliest illustrated books. We know that in the West, the Bestiarium, some copies of which circulated around 200 CE, was illustrated. And illustrated books became particularly useful to the development of scientific knowledge. Again, the alliance of words and images essential to a heightened scrutiny of the world. And it is at this point that illustrated herbaria become extremely important, not just to the development of medicine. Of course, medicinal plants are particularly important at this point, but also to the way in which we make sense of the world. Just think about the page of the book as this incredible space of potentiality where we can juxtapose words and images to create truth. And it becomes therefore important over time that this truth is represented in the most accurate of ways. So oftentimes in the history of art, it is well known that when naturalism emerges during the Renaissance, after centuries and centuries of medieval stylization, it is because of the recovery of classical ideals from Greece and Rome. And yet there is more. Plants play a key role in fine-tuning our gaze. You can see here in this beautiful example of the Vienna Discorides, extremely old, how the language is sort of like trying to get as close as possible to the beautiful representation, that it's extremely detailed to the point that many of us could identify this as blackberry even without being a professional botanist. We find this knowledge and this dance. I like to think about it as a dance between language and images where the two are intimately entwined in the Middle East, where of course early botanists began to study the plants that were mentioned in the Quran and then expanded their practice to the discovery and the understanding of plants more broadly, influencing artists like Gerardo Cibo, who during the Renaissance elevated the art of botanical illustration through an incredible revolution, as you can see here, suspending the plant into the air to show simultaneously the blooms and the root system, or the bulbs and tubers, and enshrining them like deities. This is almost like a botanical icon in which we see the landscape where the plant grows. Now, Gerardo Cibo is one of the most important illustrators of the Renaissance, really focused on plants and studied them outdoors in the field. He would take trips to these local regions, study the plant, represent it in great detail, and also introduce the beginning of what we would now consider ecological thinking by positioning the plant in its social, you can see here the people who work with the plant, as well as geographical context. But there are other forms of revolution that I became fascinated with as I researched more and more for this book. For instance, Guan Daosheng, very respected, highly respected woman artist who was chastised for painting bamboo, a subject that was reserved to men at the time, and for painting it in a very unusual way. Guan Daosheng broke with the tradition that imposed the representation of a single stem of bamboo, and she painted the plant in its own broader, rounder demeanor, as you can see here, transgressing also the prescription that women artists should paint orchids. She was particularly aware of the groundbreaking and revolutionary moment that she was single-handedly mastering at that point. Another interesting revolution happened during the Song dynasty with the artist Su Shi, whose work unfortunately no longer survives. But he apparently was the first one who painted bamboo using red ink instead of black ink. And this cost him dearly. His colleagues, his literati colleagues, objected to the use of red bamboo. They said, "Where have you ever seen red bamboo?" To which he responded, "Well, where have you ever seen black bamboo?" These questions tore Chinese art apart. Questions about realism and question about abstraction and the interpretation of what the medium of painting should be doing, could be doing, and what it actually does. Su Shi really objected to the idea that painterly representation should be understood as a realistic task. In chapter 4, I try to come to terms with the complications related to colonial roots and symbolic blooms. Botanical illustration, of course, wonderful to look at, nonetheless, comes with a number of political and gendered power structures that we are more and more coming to terms with. The role that women artists played in botanical illustrations and how these women challenged exclusion through plants, how they advanced ecological thinking, and how they also forged new artistic and scientific practices in collaboration with plants. Towards the end of the chapter, I also become concerned with cross-cultural exchanges, colonial hybrid styles, and overlooked indigenous and non-Western traditions that reveal alternative modes of plant representation that can help us to think about different directions in our relationship with plants today. One of the most famous stories that belong to this time period, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, it's tulip mania that between 1634 and 1637 created what's known as the first bubble in the history of the market. It is interesting that this first bubble is connected to art as well as plants. Artists were among the very many who invested in the broken tulips that you see here, beautifully colored and feathered specimens that exchanged hands on the market for astronomical amounts of money. We have this very famous painting by Bruegel the Younger, in which he paints those who engaged in this trading as monkeys, tellingly passing judgment, if you like. It is true that fortunes were lost and made at the time, but what is also fascinating is that at this time, a new publishing genre emerges from the interest in tulips. It's the plant catalog, the catalog that you receive every season from your trusted suppliers, originated at this point when there was a need to show the beautiful coloration of these bulbs in order to purchase them, and in order to also catalog the archive that could be purchased later on. And of course, one of the most important moments in the history of this moment, we're looking at the 17th and 18th centuries, is the rise of the still life genre, where artists combine together these incredible compositions, which of course they could have never witnessed in person. These are painterly collages. These flowers are borrowed from other artists' paintings, botanic gardens in which they were sketched by the artists, and botanical treatises. The real skill here, of course, is the realist overall impression that the artist at some point stood in front of these flowers. So, of course, what we look at here is lighting. Lighting is extremely important in blending together all these flowers that bloom at different times of the year, that belong to different geographical territories, that would have been extremely expensive to own at this time. And these flowers all come together to ventriloquize Christian morals. They're not just an appreciation of the beauty of plants. In fact, in this book and in some of my previous, I argue that this is another symptom of our fraught relationship with plants, the desire to fill in their silence with our voices, where roses have to symbolize love, poppies have to symbolize death, tulip have to symbolize unreturned love, grapes have to symbolize the passion of Christ. Plants are never enough in the history of Western art. We have to turn them into um, amplifiers of our emotions, fears, and desires. And it's also in this context that we find women leading the botanical revolution, because men would not necessarily spend much of their time painting plants and flowers. They were considered a lower genre, not quite as prestigious, not quite as expensive as history and religion. So it is at this point, through plants, that women began to conquer their deserved space in the history of Western art. Now, one of these women is incredibly remarkable and deserves a mention in this lecture. Mary Delaney, also, as part of her own personal botanical revolution, invented collage. This might look like a very detailed painting, but instead it is made with very minute cuttings of paper. The artist made 985 of these incredibly detailed collages between 1771 and 1782, between the age of 71 and 88, and only gave up when she could no longer see well enough to cut with scissors and blades these intricate details. Her love for plants was absolutely outstanding. And with these collages, she wanted to try and recreate that three-dimensionality that illustrations were somehow not capturing to her liking. And of course, towards the end of the chapter, as I mentioned, I look at the cross-pollinations that we find through botanical illustrations in India and in other cultures where botanical prints of what used to be called at the time exotic flora and fauna were produced incorporating both the aesthetics of local vernaculars and those of colonial countries where these prints were often sold. In chapter 5, I focus on architecture and design. This is perhaps one of the most predictable, I'd like to say, revolutions in the history of art. The history of architecture and design have done a much better job than the history of art proper. When I say that, I mean painting and sculpture, and acknowledging the incredible importance and source of inspiration that architects and designers have found in plants. For the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on a couple of examples from the book, but one of the most fascinating is the Corinthian capital. The acanthus leaf, which is quintessential to this architectural feature that I'm sure you're all familiar with, according to legend, comes from an experience had by Callimachus, who witnessed a maid in front of the grave of a little girl placing a basket containing some toys and covering it with a tile. Returning to that grave in the spring, Callimachus noted that a plant of acanthus had grown under the basket, creating this crowning that then he turned into the Corinthian capital, which is today the quintessential representation or emblem, if you like, of classical art in the West and beyond. Today we think about this revolution, architectural revolution, as a quintessential Western emblem, but at the time as a sign of rebirth. The Corinthian capital also traveled across the East, and it became also used in Buddhist representations in combination with the lotus flower. In this chapter, of course, I focus on William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. William Morris loved plant genuinely and truly, and his floral motifs are just the tip of the iceberg. There are many artists I focus on in this book that, in a way, have been a little bit sort of oversimplified in the tradition of art historical narration. The importance of the artist magnified at the expenses of their true love and commitment to plants. And of course, William Morris was particularly interested in the lives of plants. He studied John Gerard's General History of Plants, a book published in 1597 that he read over and over. And he also returned to plant-based dyes as part of the philosophy of the arts and crafts movement. So the arts and crafts movement, of course, being particularly important to botanical revolutions in art and architecture as a response to the Industrial Revolution during the 19th century. But in the book, of course, I also look at the botanical inspiration that played a key role in Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Style, and of course, Hector Guimard and the extremely important botanical influences and reinterpretations of Art Nouveau. The chapter 6 focuses on histories of modernity. And it is in this chapter that I trace back a very surprising history of exposing vegetality that actually begins very much earlier than the invention of photography itself, with a printing technique called nature printing that we also find in the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. What we find here, a beautiful sage leaf that has been coated in ink and pressed onto the page in order to preserve its essential anatomical structure. Well, this practice that has a long history in other cultures as well, like in China, eventually ended up being protagonist of revolutions that I could have never imagined. Benjamin Franklin, with botanist and engraver Joseph Braintnell, adapted nature printing in the 1730s in order to prevent the counterfeiting of banknotes in the United States. And he did so by using leaves that he would then cast and create molds that could be used as woodblock prints, essentially, in order to produce a design that was impossible to replicate with any accuracy. So you see here how the specificity of plants was extremely important to changing our cultural as well as economical history. But this idea that plants could be imprinted also becomes essential to the development of the history of photography. Some of the very first photograms, which is when you place an object onto a sheet of paper that has been treated with photosensitive emulsion, or plants. Plants, of course, because of their flatness, lent themselves particularly well to show the ability of the new medium to capture incredible details. Another botanical revolution, again, a woman artist, Anna Atkins, who published the book British and Foreign Flowering Plants and Ferns in 1854. This followed her 1851 publication of a book on algae that's considered to be the first book in the history of photography, the first illustrated book, in fact, through mechanical means. Her work using cyanotypes is incredible, and it's been sidelined in the history of art book for a number of reasons. Photography was considered to be, of course, a lesser art form until not so long ago, and Anne Atkins was a woman artist. I also look at the Japanese handprints of Kazumasa Ogawa, who hand-colored images of flowers in this incredible portfolio at a time in which color photography had been invented, but the reliability of photographic pigment was not strong enough for this level of accuracy. Again, botanical revolutions wherever we look. Plants played an important role too in the invention of stereoscopic color photography. The Lumiere brothers, who of course invented film, used potato starch and also granules of orange peel and blue violets. You can see how many plants went into the making of this medium in order to create autochrome. And autochrome used plants as a subject, as you can see here in this beautiful composition of flowers, because plants were extremely colorful, flowers were colorful, and they also marketed autochrome as a perfect medium to photograph gardens, flowers. So you can see how much importance plants played in this role of the invention of color photography too. When it came to the invention of film, a remarkable innovation came with the time-lapse film in 1910 called The Birth of a Flower by Percy Smith. This was the first time that people could actually appreciate the movement of plants. And one of the reviewers remarked that after seeing them move so beautifully, it becomes impossible to think that they might not actually have a presence or even feel something, which was a very forward-looking statement for that time. And in the last chapter of the book, I cover a lot of territory, starting from artists who loved plants, who I'm sure you know, like Monet, who, as you know, was a botanist as well as a painter. This is another thing that art history has sort of like sidelined. Art history likes to focus a lot more on the beautiful water lilies and what they mean to the development of Western art and beyond. But we know that Monet was incredibly fond of his plants, that he said that if he had not worked out with painting, he would have been a full-time botanist. We know that he purchased his water lilies from a business in Paris that still exists called La Tour Maria, where he became particularly interested in new hybrids of water lilies that were yellow, red, and orange. But what's also important is that at this point, the botanical revolution that pervades modern art is spiritual. Monet was interested in meditation, in Japanese culture, and he meditated in his garden. And the water lilies represent this portal onto transcendence, onto a space that is simultaneously, only through plants, accessible in the soul. Not a little thing, right? Not a little accomplishment. And simultaneously, Hilma af Klint, one of the most famous abstract artists today, but who had been relegated to obscurity for so long in the history of art, was also strongly inspired by art. Her paintings, absolutely ahead of their time, were based on her original botanical studies and led her to develop her own personal vocabulary through which plants really existed as portals to a spiritual dimension. We also find that Piet Mondrian conquered the very famous grids by abstracting trees over the span of time of nearly 10 years. You can see how the stylization of the shape of a tree eventually lands them into abstraction, or even how Matisse and his very famous cutouts depended on this enormous, enormous plant that he had in his studio, this Swiss cheese plant that he loved so much that it's so big it actually doesn't fit into this photograph. This is one of the most interesting spreads, I think, in the book. And just to wrap up, a few more examples from contemporary art to give you an idea of how the conversation about what plants can do, how they can revolutionize our thinking is taking shape even today. And a very important example is in 1936, Edward Steichen at MoMA brought real delphiniums that you see here that he grew himself, that he selectively hybridized to become over 5 feet tall, presenting therefore a living work of art and beginning another revolution that's very important in art today called bioart, artists who work with living matter. Also asking questions. Why is the painting of a flower art? But if an artist works to hybridize and manipulate a plant, is that flower not considered art by the art world. There are so many interesting artists in this section of the book that I just want to glide through to give you an idea of the scope. Like, of course, George O'Keeffe, the live potted plants in Elio Itisica's Tropicalia. I look at, of course, Lucian Freud and his intent of painting each of his potted plants in his apartment as individuals with a very special identity that it's equal in importance to the human identity in his work. Christy Belcourt, Indigenous Canadian artist who paints beautiful images in which plants are as important as everything else living on this planet. And as you can see here, holding together, holding everything in place through balance and harmony. Artists like Zachary Logan, who look at weeds as representation of queerness and diversity, or artists like Celeste Boursier-Monginot, who was concerned with plant intelligence and allowed the Scotch pines to move freely around the space at the Venice Biennale in 2015 at the at the French Pavilion. Or again, if you happen to be in New York right now, Rashid Johnson and his uses of potted plants in his installation, through which he is considering conceptions of vulnerability, silence, resilience, and community. Or Precious Okoyoman, who was also a protagonist at the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago with this installation that included kudzu as well as sugarcane, living plants that have marked the history, the ecological, the social, and economic history of the United States, which both of which have come from afar and thrive now in this country, in this climate, and both of which have been at different times desired and hated for different reasons. So negotiating through the presence and the livingness of plants, the very real contradictions, paradoxes, and complications of the world that we live in today. So I hope that this is giving you a flavor for what Botanical Revolutions wants to accomplish. And I hope that you enjoy it if you decide to purchase it.